Welcome back. As you know, the Lifelong Learning Program is offering these reflections on the Revised Common Lectionary as a service to you as preachers and listeners alike. This is our third in our series, and we today will have a reflection on the November lectionary readings. My name is Barbara Moore. I'm an associate faculty member here at CRCDS. Now, the 4 weekends in November fall on the 2nd, the 9th, the 16th, and the 23rd. Toward the end of November, I will engage in our fourth series, which will be a reflection on the coming Advent readings. After this morning's presentation, we'll gather in our chapel, and I'll share a sermon focused on the last Sunday of the church year, November 23rd, the Sunday that some denominations call the Reign of Christ, or others, Christ the King Sunday. First, a look at our Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures. The Old Testament selections for these 4 weekends in November present us with 4 different prophets: Micah, Amos, Zephaniah, and Ezekiel. The first 3, Micah, Amos, and Zephaniah, are referred to as minor prophets. But you know, the sections from each one of these prophets selected for the coming weeks are beautiful in their own right and worthy of the preacher's notice. The prophet of ancient Israel was one called, one who proclaims, trying to convey a message from God, a bearer of God's message. When we look at the prophet Jeremiah, he states, God was putting God's words in my mouth. We also sense that as much as these prophets wanted to avoid the task, they could not run from God's charge. Their words as well as their actions were critical. You know, on a small scale, we might say, or ask ourselves, is the charge of the prophet the same charge for a preacher, one who is called and compelled to proclaim the gospel? But we also know the prophets were often ignored and faced arrest and persecution. When we look at these 4 prophets, it's critical to keep in mind the historical moment when we explore them and try to weave them into a sermon. Also, so important to try to understand the different literary styles they were using: parables, laments, speeches, songs, sermons. And as you know, many prophets are barely known, some mentioned within a text. You remember the wonderful story about Nathan speaking to King David. That's such an example. Now, while it may be way too much information to give many detailed facts about an Old Testament prophet in a sermon, I think it's interesting for the listener to know that hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, men and women, prophetic voices, were calling for reform, a return to core religious values, a return to the covenant, and a shared warning about behavior that would weaken the nation and turn the people from their relationship with God. One wonders, who fills this role today? Who are the men, women, and yes, even children, who, in the midst of opposition, call for reform and for change? So before we leave the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament prophets, let me take one line from each of the 4, which could become the focus of a particular sermon. Micah warns the house of Jacob, quote, "Its rulers give judgment for a bribe," unquote. Does that happen these days? Amos writes regarding God's rejection of some external worship practices and issues a call, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Does it? Zephaniah continues, quote, neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. How true. I wonder how that fits when we look at the huge economic disparity in our country these days. And finally, Ezekiel writes a more positive word about the restoration of the people. I, quote, I will seek out my sheep and rescue them from all the places to which they have been scattered. Do we do that? And as you hear the sermon, which will be delivered in chapel about sheep and goats, I think you can make a connection here. Now, as we move to the New Testament, during these 4 weeks, we have 3 readings from the first letter to the Thessalonians and 1 from Ephesians. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul reminds his readers of his compassion and loving treatment of the church. He attempts to answer the community's questions about life after death and tries to encourage them to be supportive of one another. And this encouragement continues in the reading from the 5th chapter of the 1 Thessalonians. And also, he makes mention of end times. He writes, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Paul is reflecting a kind of urgency because of the commonly held belief that Jesus' return was imminent. But now to the Gospels. The 4 Gospels this month from Matthew, the theme that seems to be prevalent among the 4 is the question of behavior and the measurement of behavior. The last Gospel, which will be part of our sermon today, is a teaching about behavior and judgment. When we look at Matthew 23, which is read on November 2nd, it is also a reflection on the behavior of religious leaders. Jesus speaks about measurement and how they measured people and how he measures his followers. And he shares the stunning, really radical statement, the greatest among you will be your servant. Yet Jesus is critical of religious leaders, not only for their emphasis on externals and their behavior, but also critical, and listen to this line, quote, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. But they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. I find this quote one of the most painful and disturbing in the Gospels. Why? Because we see that kind of behavior all around us. Church and government structures and systems that lay heavy burdens on others. And when there is a call to lift them, especially burdens on the marginal, hands and hearts seem paralyzed, don't they? I find a great sermon topic located in this line. Chapter 25 in Matthew is also powerful. First, there are 2 parables about watchfulness, responsibilities, alertness, behavior. Verses 1 through 13 reflects on the end times and a wedding theme, and a wedding theme, both of which are common in Scripture. We have the 10 bridesmaids. They may have been part of the groom's household and were awaiting his return with his bride from her family home, which may have been delayed. The behavior of the bridesmaids may reflect something happening in Matthew's community. Those ready for Jesus' return and those whose hearts were elsewhere. Well, the delayed bridegroom comes at a surprising time, a very unlikely time. And so the message here seems to be a message of alertness and readiness. We think with their lamps, we think of Jesus' words, "Let your light shine." There is another very painful line in these gospel readings. "Truly I tell you, I do not know you." I find that so chilling. I do not know you. How will you and I be known? How will our congregations be known? And the next parable is about the talents. Remember, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1. This parable is in the middle of chapter 25, and it differs from the 2 surrounding it. In what way? Note the opening line. Not the kingdom of heaven is like, or in the gospel we will hear shortly, when the Son of Man comes. But this parable begins with the line, "For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them." I think sometimes we take this particular parable on the talents and we see there was a man and we equate that with God. That's not what the text says. Traditionally, when we hear this sermon, we are prepared for a message about the use of our gifts and our talents. But a talent, as you know, in Jesus' day, represents a large sum of money. So on one level, this parable takes on a socio-economic layer of meaning. Yes, we're called to use our gifts that God gave us. But maybe this parable is saying something else. Maybe this parable is reflecting on Matthew's community. And I want to focus on one line. When the 3rd slave buried his 1 talent, the money, one senses he did it out of fear. Why? Listen to what he says about the rich man. He knew the rich man expected investment and return on his money, and he buried it. He says, quote, "I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter." That is a stunning statement. And the rich man agreed with him. "Well, you wicked, lazy slave, you knew me. So if you knew me, why didn't you invest and get interest?" In other words, I wanted the profit. Might this parable be the story of a poor fellow who absolutely refused to bleed his fellow workers, to make money off their backs, to satisfy his master's greed? There is a very current theme in this parable. Greedy banks, whistleblowers, poor families pushing back, and descriptions of the poor we often hear. "You lazy, lazy person." So my friends, in light of all these readings during the 4 weeks of November, what are some possible themes you and I might explore? We might ask, where are the prophets of our own time? What is the modern use of these parables? How can they apply to our lived experience? Especially in the gospel coming, we might ask ourselves, what measures are we using in judging others? Or are we alert to all that is around us, prepared for God's breaking in to our daily lives, even in unexpected ways, like the groom? Do we, as pastoral leaders, understand our own context? Paul understood his, and showed great encouragement. And perhaps the most poignant of all themes might be this: do you and I lay heavy burdens on others as we exercise our own authority? Thank you so much for listening. I invite you now to come down to our chapel here at CRCDS and listen to a sermon prepared on Matthew 25. Thank you.